Episode title: The Silicon Shadow of the Kremlin. Chapter 1: The Ghost in the Machine. Welcome to Synapse Daily. Picture a world where the internet wasn't built for cat videos, social media, or e-commerce. Imagine a digital web designed with a singular, chillingly efficient purpose: to manage the pulse of a global superpower. We are traveling back to the year 1962. The Cold War isn't just a military standoff, it is a battle of systems. In the United States, ARPANET is a faint whisper in a laboratory. But in the Soviet Union, in the basement of the Kiev Institute of Cybernetics, a man named Victor Glushkov is looking at a different frontier. He isn't looking at the stars, though the Soviets were winning the space race. He is looking at the invisible flow of data. Glushkov had a vision that was terrifyingly ambitious. He wanted to build OGAS, the all-state automated system for the gathering and processing of information. This wasn't just a computer. It was a digital nervous system. He wanted to link every factory, every farm, every mine, and every grocery store in the Soviet Union across 11 time zones into a single, real-time electronic network. Think about the sheer scale of this madness. The USSR was a command economy. Every year, bureaucrats in Moscow had to decide how many shoes to make in Ukraine, how much grain to harvest in Kazakhstan, and where every single ton of Siberian steel should be shipped. By the early 1960s, this system was screaming. It was collapsing under its own weight. There was too much data and not enough human brains to process it. The paper storm, as they called it, was burying the revolution. Glushkov's solution? Don't use humans. Humans are slow. Humans are corrupt. Use the machine. He envisioned a future where the entire economy was an algorithm. A socialist Amazon before the world even knew what a microchip truly was. Chapter 2: The Prophet of Cybernetics. Victor Mikhailovich Glushkov was no ordinary bureaucrat. He was a mathematical genius with the energy of a nuclear reactor. He lived in a world of pure logic. To him, the chaos of the Soviet economy wasn't a political failure, it was a complexity crisis. He famously sat down and did the math: if the USSR didn't automate its planning by 1980, the economic planning tasks would grow so complex that the entire Soviet population would have to become bureaucrats just to keep up with the paperwork. Imagine the scene inside the Kremlin's gold-trimmed halls. Glushkov stands before the old guard, the men in heavy wool suits who survived Stalin. He shows them blueprints of a network that could predict a bread shortage in Leningrad 3 months before it happened. He describes a world where electronic money replaces paper rubles. Yes, in 1962, while the West was still using rotary phones, Glushkov was proposing a cashless society managed by a central artificial intelligence. But there was a fundamental flaw. In a system built on secrets, silos, and creative accounting, information is the ultimate weapon. To make OGAS work, every factory manager had to be honest. Every minister had to share their data. In the Soviet Union of the 1960s, honesty was a dangerous currency. If the computer knows exactly how much steel you have, you can't hide the surplus to trade on the black market. If the computer sees you are failing your quota, you can't lie to the premier. Glushkov wasn't just building a network, he was building a giant, electronic truth machine. And the Soviet elite? They were terrified of the truth. Chapter 3: The Technical Blueprint, a 20,000-node dream. Let's get into the guts of the machine. What would OGAS have actually looked like? Glushkov's plan was a 3-tier pyramid of digital power. At the top, in Moscow, a massive central computer center. In the middle, about 200 regional centers in major cities. And at the bottom? As many as 20,000 local terminals located at key production sites across the continent. They weren't using the slow, clunky vacuum tube machines of the 50s. Glushkov was pushing for the BSM-6, a Soviet supercomputer that was, for a brief moment, the fastest in Europe. The network was designed to be resilient. If one node was destroyed, the data would reroute. Sounds familiar? That's exactly how the modern internet works. But OGAS was more than just a communication link. It was designed to run a software called the Unified State Network of Computer Centers. This software would run a mathematical model of the entire country. It was essentially a digital twin of the Soviet Union. Imagine a factory in the Urals that produces tractor gears. In the OGAS world, the moment a gear is finished, a sensor triggers a data point. The regional center sees it. The central hub in Moscow calculates that these gears are needed for a shipment in Vladivostok. The logistics are automated. No phone calls. No bribes. No months of waiting for a signed letter from a drunk official. It was real-time socialism. Glushkov even envisioned a remote access system where workers could input suggestions into the network from their factory floor. He was designing a decentralized, democratic data web within a centralized, autocratic state. The irony was palpable. Chapter 4: The Shadow of the CIA. While Glushkov was fighting the Soviet bureaucracy, someone else was watching very closely: the United States. In Washington, the CIA was terrified. They had seen the Soviets beat them into space with Sputnik. They saw the Soviets building the largest hydrogen bombs. Now, intelligence reports were landing on the desks of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations saying the Soviets were about to automate their entire economy. The Americans called it the Cybernetic scare. U.S. intelligence analysts warned that if the Soviets successfully built OGAS, they would achieve a level of economic efficiency that capitalism couldn't match. They feared a computer gap. This led to a strange, invisible arms race. The U.S. began pouring money into ARPANET, partially as a response to the perceived threat of Soviet cybernetics. But there was a difference. The U.S. government gave money to scientists and let them play. In the USSR, Glushkov had to beg for every ruble from men who didn't know what a bit or a byte was. The CIA actually started a disinformation campaign. They wanted the Soviet leadership to believe that computers were a Western capitalist trap designed to undermine the Communist Party's authority. And the tragic part? The Soviet bureaucrats believed the CIA's propaganda more than they believed their own scientists. They began to view Glushkov not as a savior, but as a man trying to replace the party with a black box. The tension was reaching a breaking point. The year 1970 would be the moment the future was decided. Chapter 5: The Night Logic Died, the 1970 Budget Showdown. By 1970, the OGAS project was at a crossroads. It wasn't just a blueprint anymore, it was a political hand grenade. Victor Glushkov knew that to save the Soviet Union, he needed a massive commitment of resources, roughly 20 billion rubles. To put that in perspective, that was more than the Soviets were spending on their space program and military combined at the time. In October 1970, a meeting was called that would decide the fate of the 20th century. Glushkov walked into the Kremlin to face the Council of Ministers. He wasn't just facing politicians, he was facing the Red Tsars of the Ministry of Finance. Glushkov began his presentation. He spoke with the fire of a man who saw the future. He explained that OGAS would pay for itself in 5 years and double the nation's GDP in 15. But as he spoke, he noticed something chilling. The Minister of Finance, Vasily Garbuzov, wasn't looking at the charts. He was whispering to Alexei Kosygin, the premier. Garbuzov's argument was simple and devastating: computers are for counting, not for leading. The Ministry of Finance feared that if OGAS became the brain of the nation, the Ministry of Finance would become obsolete. Why do you need a minister to balance the books when an algorithm does it perfectly in nanoseconds? This was a turf war. The bureaucracy chose its own survival over the survival of the state. They slashed the budget. They told Glushkov he could keep his toys, but the nationwide network was dead. They chose paper over light. Chapter 6: The Great Regression, From Innovation to Imitation. With the dream of a unified network shattered, the Soviet computer industry took a fatal turn. Instead of following Glushkov's original designs, which were arguably a decade ahead of the West, the leadership made a safe decision. They ordered Soviet engineers to stop innovating and start copying. This was the birth of the ES-EVM series, direct clones of the American IBM System/360. Imagine the demoralization of the Soviet scientific elite. Men like Glushkov and Sergei Lebedev had built machines that rivaled the best in the world. Now, they were being told to take apart smuggled American hardware and reverse engineer it. This wasn't just a loss of pride, it was a strategic catastrophe. By the time the Soviets successfully cloned an IBM chip, the Americans had already moved 2 generations ahead. The computer gap became a canyon. Glushkov watched in horror as his 20,000-node dream was replaced by isolated, disconnected islands of IBM clones that couldn't talk to each other. The Soviet Union had effectively decided to build a highway system where every road ended at the city limits. Chapter 7, 1974, the year the future was cancelled. 1974 marks the official abandonment of the OGAS project in its radical form. While the name lived on in dry bureaucratic documents, the spirit was gone. Glushkov was sidelined. The government issued a decree focusing on local automated systems. This was the final nail in the coffin. By decentralizing the automation, they ensured it would never work. A factory in Magnitogorsk might have a computer, but it couldn't see what the factory in Minsk was doing. The paper storm returned with a vengeance. Ironically, as the Soviet Union retreated from the digital frontier, the West was accelerating. 1974 was the year the Altair 8800 was being designed in the US, the spark of the personal computer revolution. Glushkov spent his final years in a state of prophetic grief. He famously wrote that the failure to implement OGAS would lead to the total collapse of the Soviet economy by the late 1980s. He was right to the year. Without a way to manage the complexity of their own creation, the Soviet leaders were flying a jumbo jet in the dark with no instruments. Chapter 8, the Cybernetic What If? Let's pause and ask the big question, could OGAS have saved the USSR? It's a polarizing debate among historians. Some argue that OGAS would have simply created a techno-Stalinism, a more efficient way to oppress people. They imagine a world where the KGB didn't need informants because the network tracked every transaction and movement. But others, like Glushkov himself, believed OGAS would have democratized the Union. He wanted a system where the wisdom of the crowd was fed into the central planners. If OGAS had been built, the 1980s might not have seen breadlines and empty shelves. The algorithm would have seen the shortage coming and rerouted supplies instantly. Would the Berlin Wall have fallen if the East was more technologically advanced than the West? We are looking at a cyber-Soviet timeline that feels like pure science fiction, yet it was only a few signatures away from reality. Chapter 9, The Legacy of a Lost Net. Victor Glushkov died in 1982, never seeing his network come to life. But his ghost haunts our modern world. Today, we live in the world Glushkov envisioned, but under a different flag. When you look at companies like Amazon or Google, they are essentially doing exactly what OGAS proposed. They use massive data networks to predict demand, manage logistics, and influence behavior. The planned economy didn't die with the Soviet Union, it just moved into the private sector. The tragedy of 1974 isn't just a Russian story. It's a human story about what happens when fear of change outweighs the vision of the future. The Soviets had the blueprints for the 21st century in 1962, but they were too afraid of losing their 19th century power structures to build it. Chapter 10, OGAS vs ARPANET, Why the Web Won and the Grid Lost. It is the ultimate historical irony. While Glushkov was struggling to get the Kremlin to fund a single node, the Americans were building ARPANET. But why did one become the world-spanning internet we use today, while the other became a footnote in history? The answer lies in the topology of power. ARPANET was designed by scientists for scientists. It was decentralized, flexible, and, crucially, unstructured. It grew like a weed, messy and organic. OGAS, on the other hand, was designed to be a top-down hierarchy. It was a mirror of the Soviet state, rigid, disciplined, and controlled. In the West, the Internet succeeded because it didn't ask for permission to exist. In the USSR, OGAS failed because it had to ask for permission for every single byte. When ARPANET faced a technical hurdle, engineers bypassed it. When OGAS faced a bureaucratic hurdle, the project was frozen for years. The Internet became a playground for innovation, the OGAS became a battlefield for ministers. We see here that technology is never neutral, it carries the DNA of the society that builds it. Chapter 11, The Secret Cyberwar, Soviet Hackers and OGAS Ruins. Even after the project was officially sidelined in 1974, the ghost of OGAS lived on in the shadows. A generation of young Soviet mathematicians, who had been inspired by Glushkov, found themselves in a strange limbo. They had the brilliance but not the hardware. This led to the birth of a unique Soviet hacker culture. These weren't hackers looking to steal credit cards. They were information scavengers. They spent the late 70s and 80s trying to link local computer centers using makeshift modems and pirated Western protocols. In the ruins of the OGAS dream, they built small, underground networks. There are stories of engineers in Novosibirsk connecting to centers in Moscow using telephone lines that were officially dead. They were trying to prove Glushkov right, even as the country around them was literally running out of food. They were the first ones to see the collapse coming, because they were the only ones looking at the real, unedited data flowing through the remaining lines. Chapter 12, The Dragon's Algorithm, Modern China and OGAS 2.0. To understand the true potential and the true horror of what Glushkov was building, we have to look at modern China. Today, the Chinese social credit system and their massive AI-driven logistics networks are, in many ways, the spiritual successors to OGAS. The Chinese Communist Party has succeeded where the Soviets failed. They have integrated high-speed data, facial recognition, and real-time economic tracking into a single state-controlled apparatus. They have built the truth machine Glushkov envisioned, but they've used it to create a digital panopticon. Is this what OGAS would have become? A system where your economic contribution is calculated by an algorithm and your rights are adjusted accordingly? Glushkov believed his system would lead to electronic democracy, but history suggests that in the hands of an autocracy, data is more often used as a leash than a ladder. Chapter 13, Glushkov's Last Letter, A Prophet Without Honor. By the early 1980s, Victor Glushkov was dying. He had spent his life chasing a ghost. On his deathbed in 1982, he wrote a final letter to his family and the scientific community. It wasn't a letter of regret, but a warning. He wrote that the complexity crisis was no longer coming, it was here. He predicted that without the network, the Soviet Union would lose its ability to perceive reality. He was right. When the Chernobyl disaster happened in 1986, the lack of real-time, transparent data sharing, the very thing OGAS was designed to fix, turned a tragedy into a global catastrophe. Glushkov died just as the first IBM PCs were hitting the market. He never saw the personal computer revolution. He never saw the fall of the Berlin Wall. He died a hero of science in a state that had already decided to commit suicide by bureaucracy. Chapter 14, Cyber-Socialism, Can an Algorithm Replace a Market? As we wrap up this journey, we have to face a haunting question that modern economists are still debating: could it work now? With today's computing power, quantum computers, neural networks, and 6G, could we finally build OGAS? Could an AI manage a nation's economy better than the invisible hand of the free market? Some modern theorists argue that big data has made central planning possible for the first time in history. They point to Walmart and Amazon, which operate internally like planned economies more efficient than most countries. But the lesson of 1974 isn't about the speed of the processor. It's about the human element. The OGAS project didn't fail because the computers weren't fast enough. It failed because the people in power were afraid of losing that power. Logic is a threat to those who thrive on chaos. Chapter 15, The Silence of the Servers, Closing Thoughts. The story of OGAS is a tragedy of what might have been. It is the story of a digital future that was strangled in its cradle. In 1974, the Soviet Union had the chance to lead the world into the information age. Instead, they chose to hide behind paper curtains. When we look at our phones today, we are looking at the realization of Glushkov's dream, but it's a dream owned by corporations rather than a state. The next time you see a smart city or an automated supply chain, remember the man in Kiev who saw it all coming 60 years ago. This has been Synapse Daily. History isn't just a list of dates, it's a series of choices. In 1974, the USSR made the wrong one. And that choice changed the world forever. Thank you for listening. If you found this journey through the lost Soviet internet fascinating, please consider supporting us. Like this video if you learned something new. Comment your thoughts below. Could OGAS have saved the USSR? And don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating stories from the intersection of history and technology.